Autumn, 1839, Salem, Massachusetts. The night was so quiet you could hear the wind scraping dead leaves against the stones of the old cemetery. 3 men stood there in the dark, their lanterns casting sickly yellow halos on the crooked headstones. They had no priest, no official order, no permission, but they had shovels, and they had a name: Abigail Northwood. The men dug in silence. Their breath steamed in the cold air, their boots sank into the damp earth, and the sound of metal striking stone echoed like gunshots through the night. It took them 3 hours to reach the coffin. By the time they did, one man had already started to mutter a prayer under his breath, though no one joined him. The lid was pried open with the groan of old wood. Inside lay Abigail, white as frost, her hair fanned out like black seaweed. But what froze the men where they stood was not the sight of her face. It was the sound that came next, scratching, from the inside of the coffin. When they lifted her into the moonlight, her fingers were bloody and her nails splintered. And then her eyes opened. One man dropped his lantern, another screamed. The third could not move at all. Abigail looked at them one by one, like a bride choosing her witnesses. Then she stood, barefoot, soil clinging to her nightdress, and walked past them, out of the cemetery and into the sleeping town. By dawn, word had spread. Some said she had been buried alive, and that this was a cruel mistake. Others whispered of darker things, of bargains made in the cold silence of the grave. They said she was seen standing at the church steps before sunrise, waiting, her head tilted as though listening to a voice no one else could hear. The men who dug her up swore they would never speak of that night, but one went mad before winter, another disappeared entirely, and the last died with her name on his lips. This story was known, early lost, erased from the memory of Salem. But tonight, you will hear everything they tried to hide. Now write in the comments which city and what time you are listening to us from, so we know who is absorbing this secret. In 1839, Salem was a town trying to forget its own shadow. The witch trials were half a century behind them, yet the soil still seemed stained by the memory of fire and rope. Ships came and went from the harbor, carrying spices, silks, and gossip from faraway lands. The taverns were filled with sailors telling lies, the church bells rang faithfully each Sunday, and on the surface, life was civilized. But those who lived there knew that Salem had 2 faces, the one it showed the world, and the one it revealed only after nightfall. At sunset, the streets emptied quickly. Candles were snuffed early, shutters locked tight. It wasn't fear of bandits that made people hurry home. It was something else, something nameless. Families told stories of footsteps on the roof, of voices whispering at the window, of doors that opened on their own. Farmers swore their cattle refused to graze in certain corners of the pasture, no matter how green the grass. Children were warned never to play near the old well by the North Road, though no one would say why. That autumn, strange things began to happen again. The church bells tolled twice in the middle of the night, though no hand touched the rope. The gravediggers reported that certain mounds of soil seemed to have been disturbed, as though something had pushed upward from below. Dogs howled at nothing, and milk turned sour overnight in homes near the burial ground. And then came the night Abigail rose. It was as if the earth itself had opened a hidden door. The return of a dead woman was not just a tragedy or a miracle, it was a sign. To some, it meant punishment. To others, a chance to fulfill forbidden promises. The town tried to stay quiet about it, but gossip has its own hunger. Soon, whispers of her pale figure standing by the church spread like fire. Mothers pulled their children closer. Men who once boasted of courage began carrying iron charms in their pockets. Salem was holding its breath, waiting, watching, knowing something was coming, but powerless to stop it. And if you feel ready to take the next step and become part of this journey, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Abigail Northwood was not just another name on a headstone. She was the daughter of Jonathan Northwood, a shipwright whose hands were always black with pitch and salt. Her mother Ruth had died giving birth to her, and some said Abigail carried that shadow with her, From the moment she first drew breath, she grew up quiet, strange, too still for a child. While other children played by the harbor, Abigail spent hours sitting alone near the cliffs, staring at the horizon as though listening to something far away. When she was 17, she met Elias Crane. Elias was a sailor with storm-colored eyes, a man of few words but strong hands. The town gossiped about them, about the way she waited for him when his ship sailed, about the way she ignored every other man in Salem. For a while, people said Abigail was happy. She was seen smiling, laughing even, her hair unbound in the wind. But happiness does not last long in places like Salem. In the winter of 1837, Elias's ship went missing in a storm. The sea gave no body back. The harbor gave no wreckage. For weeks, Abigail walked the shoreline every evening, her skirts dragging in the wet sand, her face pale as the moon. Some said she sang to the waves, soft and low, as though calling something back. And then, she changed. By the spring of 1838, neighbors noticed she stopped speaking to anyone at all. She stopped going to church. She was seen near the burial ground at night, kneeling in the dirt, whispering into the soil. Old women crossed themselves when they passed her. Men muttered that she had gone mad with grief. The doctor's records from that year are unsettling. He describes her heart as too fast, then too slow, as though it followed some other rhythm than life itself. By summer of 1839, she was little more than a shadow, thin and hollow-eyed. And then, suddenly, she was dead. The cause on the death record reads, fever, but the doctor's private notes, which we have, say something else. He wrote, her eyes were wide, not with pain, but with expectation, as though she saw something we could not. The town buried her quickly, too quickly, and 3 weeks later, the dead began to walk. After Abigail's return, the town did not speak her name in the daylight. But at night, her story spread from house to house like smoke. Some said she had been buried alive, scratching the coffin lid in desperation until the men dug her up. But those who had seen her face in the moonlight said otherwise. They swore she was calm, too calm. 3 days after she walked out of the cemetery, the first strange event happened. A child vanished. A boy of 8, last seen playing with a wooden hoop near the churchyard. His parents searched the entire town. Neighbors lit lanterns and scoured the woods, but there was no trace of him. No footprints, no torn clothing, nothing. Then another disappearance. A farmhand on the outskirts of Salem never came back from feeding the livestock. The cows were found bellowing in the field, the gate left open. People began locking their doors even before sunset now. And always, someone reported seeing Abigail. She was seen walking along the edge of the forest. She was seen standing by the church door, staring at the cross. She was seen outside her own house, which had been left empty since the funeral. Some swore she was not walking but gliding, her feet barely touching the earth. The doctor who had declared her dead refused to leave his home. The gravediggers who had opened her coffin could not sleep. They claimed they heard scratching under their floors at night, faint and patient, as though something was waiting. By the second week, even the minister admitted something was wrong. He preached about unnatural resurrections and warned that the devil was walking among them. But his voice trembled in the pulpit, and no one believed he had the courage to confront her. The town split into factions. Some wanted to dig up the grave again, to make sure she was truly gone this time. Others said she should be left alone, that she had been chosen by God or by something older, and interfering could bring disaster. But no one stopped watching her. And on the night of the harvest moon, every lantern in Salem was extinguished at once. The entire town sat in darkness, and in that silence, someone heard footsteps. The night of the harvest moon was unlike any Salem had seen since the witch trials. The entire town plunged into blackness, as if someone had smothered every flame by hand. The sky glowed silver, the moon so bright it painted every building in pale light, but no candle would stay lit. And then they saw her. Abigail was standing in the graveyard, not near her own grave, but at the far end, by the old unmarked stones where the executed witches were rumored to be buried. She was not alone. 3 figures stood with her. Men, or what looked like men, tall and gaunt, their faces hidden beneath hoods stitched from coarse sackcloth. They held something between them, a small bundle wrapped in white cloth, limp as a doll. A scream broke the silence. Someone had been watching from their window. By the time the townsfolk reached the graveyard with pitchforks and axes, Abigail and the hooded men were gone. But the ground was open, freshly dug. When they peered inside, they saw bones. Too many bones, tangled together like roots. Some were animal, some were not. At the bottom of the pit was a wooden box, half rotten, half buried. Inside it were iron Innsbruck's shackles sized for wrists, a rusted iron collar, and carved into the inside of the box with something sharp were words in Latin. Words that the minister later translated: "Death is the doorway, love is the price." The town was gripped by terror. Some believed Abigail was part of a cult, summoning something unspeakable. Others believed she had been taken against her will, used for some ritual she could not escape. But then came the wedding notice, handwritten, nailed to the church door one morning, in ink so dark it looked like blood. It read simply, "On the final night of October, Abigail Northwood shall be joined in union with Elias Crane, in the place where the living dare not go." Elias Crane had been dead for nearly 2 years. The notice bore no signature. That night, people barricaded themselves inside their homes. The church bell rang once and no one claimed to have rung it. Halloween was 3 nights away. The days leading up to the final night of October were a fever. The entire town of Salem seemed to hold its breath. Some families packed their wagons and fled toward Boston, not waiting to see what might happen. Others stayed, either out of faith, pride, or the terrible fascination that keeps people from looking away from a fire. The minister declared a fast. He rang the church bell and gathered the remaining townsfolk to pray. But few came. The sound of the bell seemed hollow now, as though the air itself refused to carry holy words. The men who had dug up Abigail were nowhere to be seen. One was rumored to have hung himself in his barn. Another was said to have been found wandering the marshes, clothes torn, speaking nonsense about bride's vows in the dirt. And Abigail was seen again. A midwife swore she saw her walking through the forest at twilight, her dress torn, her hair wet with dew, holding something small against her chest. Others they heard a woman laughing softly near the churchyard, though when they looked, no one was there. On the night of October 31st, every man who could carry a weapon gathered in the square. They were determined to stop whatever was coming. Pitchforks, muskets, axes, the tools of farmers turned to tools of war. When the moon rose, they followed its light to the burial ground. What they found there was not what they expected. Abigail stood in the center of the graveyard. The hooded figures were there too, their shapes long and unnatural under the moonlight. At her feet was a circle drawn in ash, and within it, a second coffin, its lid ajar. They swore they saw a hand inside the coffin, a man's hand. The townsfolk raised their weapons, but before anyone could strike, Abigail turned to them. Slowly, calmly, she smiled, and then every lantern, every torch, every weapon was extinguished at once, as if swallowed by a great breath. The night went black. When light returned, just for a moment, the graveyard was empty. No Abigail, no figures, no coffin, only the words carved into the earth where she had stood. The bride is given, the vow is sealed. After that night, Salem was never the same. The graveyard remained silent, but the people were not. The town square became a place of shouting, accusations, and wild theories. Who had opened the grave in the first place? Who had nailed the wedding notice to the church door? Who had joined Abigail in the graveyard, hidden under those hooded masks? The minister demanded an inquiry. He gathered what men were still brave enough to act and called them to the meeting house. They decided that the only way to restore order was to find someone to blame. The gravediggers were arrested first. They were dragged from their homes in the middle of the night, their wives screaming, their children clinging to them. The men didn't fight back. They looked hollow, as if something had already been taken from them. In the meeting house, they were questioned under candle light until dawn. What they said chilled everyone in the room. They claimed they had not decided to dig up Abigail on their own. They said they had been told to, not by a man, not by any living voice, but by dreams. Dreams that repeated, night after night, until they could not resist. They said they saw Elias Crane in those dreams, standing on the water, calling them by name. The minister ordered them imprisoned in the cellar of the meeting house, but by morning they were gone. The locks were still bolted. The guards swore no one had passed them. The floor was wet with salt water. By November, the entire town was fracturing. Neighbors accused each other of helping Abigail. Farmhouses were abandoned overnight. Merchants closed their shops. People began speaking of leaving Salem altogether. And then, one night, a new sound came from the graveyard. Not footsteps, not shovels. A bell. The bell of the church ringing slowly, one toll at a time, even though the bell rope had been cut days earlier to stop it from ringing at night. The minister collapsed the next morning and died before he could finish a final sermon. His last words, witnessed by 3 people, were, "She is not gone. She is waiting for the second vow." There was one man who claimed to see it all. He never spoke in the town square. He never raised his voice. But weeks later, after most had fled Salem, he left behind a written testimony. His name was Silas Ward, a cooper who lived near the edge of town. The letter was found hidden under the floorboards of his home when it was torn down decades later. Silas said he could not sleep the night of October 31st. He said he heard the bell, not just with his ears, but in his bones, every toll sinking into his chest like a hammer blow. And something made him go to the graveyard. He wrote that he knew it was madness, but his legs carried him without his consent. He hid behind a stone wall and watched. He wrote that the moon was brighter than he had ever seen it, so bright that the shadows of the headstones stretched like black fingers across the ground. In the center of the graveyard stood Abigail. Her dress was torn but white, and her hair hung wet down her back. The hooded figures were there, but closer now, standing like sentinels at the edge of the circle of ash. And then, Silas swore on his own soul, Elias Crane rose from the coffin. He wrote that Elias did not look like a corpse. His skin was pale, yes, but his eyes were open and they burned with something Silas could not describe. Not fire, not light, something older. Abigail stepped forward. She knelt by the coffin and kissed Elias on the mouth. Silas said that when she did, the air around them turned cold enough to see his own breath. One of the hooded figures began to speak in a language Silas did not know. The words were deep, guttural, vibrating through the ground. And then Elias stood. He took Abigail's hand, and together they stepped into the circle. Silas wrote that they spoke no vows, and yet the earth shook as though something had been agreed upon. The hooded figures bowed. When Silas fled, he heard something following him. Not footsteps, but a second heartbeat behind his own. He left town the next day. When Silas's testimony began to circulate, it did something strange to the men who read it. At first, they laughed nervously, as men do when they fear something but will not admit it. They called him a liar, a drunk, a man haunted by his own guilty conscience. But by the next moon, some of those very same men began to dream. Not ordinary dreams, not the confused shadows of a restless mind, but the kind that leave a man waking in a cold sweat, staring at the wall, afraid to move. They said they dreamed of a circle drawn in ash. They said they saw Abigail standing at its center, her face pale, her eyes calm, her hand outstretched as if inviting them to join her. One man swore he heard her speak in the dream. She said, "How is name?" He woke with his heart pounding so hard he thought it might burst from his chest. The next night he had the dream again, this time longer, this time closer. And then, on the third night, he rose from his bed and walked barefoot into the woods. His wife followed him, lantern in hand, and found him standing at the edge of the burial ground, staring into the dark, smiling faintly as if listening to someone she could not hear. By morning, he was gone. This happened again and again. Young men, old men, some who had known Abigail, some who had never spoken to her. All of them claimed she called them. All of them vanished within 3 nights of the first dream. The remaining townsfolk grew desperate. Some blamed Silas for writing his testimony, saying he had cursed the town by putting the story into words. His house was burned to the ground, but by then he was long gone. Still, the dream spread. The minister's replacement, a man from Boston who claimed he feared no superstition, lasted less than a week before he too fled. In his journal, he wrote only one sentence before disappearing into the night. "She does not call to the dead. She calls to the living." And that was when the first graves were found empty. The first empty grave was discovered by accident. A farmer was passing by the burial ground at dawn when he saw the earth sagging inward, as if a tunnel had collapsed beneath it. He went to fetch the gravedigger, but there was no gravedigger anymore. The man had vanished weeks ago, so the farmer dug himself. The coffin was there, but its lid was thrown open, its contents gone. No bones, no cloth, nothing but a faint trail of footprints in the dirt that led out of the grave and toward the forest. By noon, others came to look. They opened another grave, another empty coffin, and then another. 6 were empty by the end of the day. The town was in a frenzy. Setsti, Ohm believed this was the work of grave robbers, but there were no signs of digging from above, only from within. The earth was pushed upward, not down. That night, no one slept. Lanterns were lit in every house, muskets loaded, windows nailed shut. But despite all this, more graves were found disturbed the next morning, and this time, there were marks in the earth around them, circles of ash, as though something had been performed there. The people who had stayed this long now faced a choice: leave or prepare for a war no one knew how to fight. The men who remained decided to stake out the graveyard. They hid among the stones with their guns, waiting. The night was silent, too silent, until just after midnight when a figure appeared. Abigail. She moved among the graves with a lantern, as calm as a woman tending her garden. She stopped at one of the fresh graves and knelt, placing her hand flat on the soil. The men were frozen, unable to act. They said later that their guns felt too heavy to lift. They could only watch as the earth shifted and broke open. From the inside, something climbed out, and when the moonlight fell across its face, the men swore it looked just like Elias Crane. But Elias had already been seen, standing beside Abigail, which meant this was someone else, someone newly awakened. The men who saw the grave open that night did not speak until morning. When they did, their words sent shockwaves through Salem. They swore that what climbed out of the earth was not a ghost, not a pale shade of its former self, but whole, breathing, standing, with eyes wide open, as though it had simply been sleeping. And yet, there was something wrong. The creature did not look at them. It looked only at Abigail. When she nodded, it stepped toward her and joined her in the circle of ash. They said the moment it crossed that circle, the air grew heavier, as though a storm was building in every direction at once. The men fled before seeing what happened next. They claimed the ground trembled under their feet, that the headstones groaned as if they might split in two. The next morning, the town discovered 2 more graves had been emptied during the night. And not just any graves. These were the graves of men who had been known for their violence, a drunkard who had once beaten his wife nearly to death, a thief who had been hanged for murder. It was as though Abigail was building something, not just raising the dead, choosing them. The minister's replacement fled that same day, leaving behind a single note on the pulpit. "You cannot stop a wedding once the bride has chosen." The town's remaining leaders called a meeting. The plan was simple: burn the graveyard, salt the earth, destroy whatever was buried there. But before they could act, a new terror struck. 2 of the men who had watched Abigail that night were found dead in their beds, their faces strangely serene, their hands folded across their chests as if prepared for burial. And carved into the wood above each of their doors was the same message: witnesses must become participants. That was when Salem understood. This was not simply about Abigail and Elias. This was an invitation, a ritual that required more and more souls, willing or unwilling, until the union was complete. And as November deepened, more graves opened, more names were whispered, more men began to dream of her face. The wedding was not over. It had only just begun. By mid-November, the men of Salem could bear no more. Every night another grave was found disturbed. Every morning brought new disappearances. The dreams were spreading like a fever, even to those who swore they had never laid eyes on Abigail. So they gathered, 13 men, armed with muskets, axes, and torches. They swore an oath before sundown that they would not return until the graveyard was destroyed, even if it meant killing Abigail herself. The night was bitter cold. The frost crunched under their boots as they marched to the burial ground. They expected to find it silent. It wasn't. The moment they crossed the gate, they heard voices, low, chanting voices, coming from the far end of the graveyard. Lantern light flickered between the headstones. The men moved closer, their breath fogging the air, muskets raised. What they saw froze them where they stood. Abigail was there, Elias was with her, and so were at least 6 others, all men, standing in a circle, hands clasped, heads bowed. But the men swore they recognized 2 of those faces. They were the gravediggers, the ones who had vanished from the meeting house cellar. The chanting grew louder. The air smelled of smoke and iron. The circle of ash began to glow faintly as if lit from below. One of the Salem men panicked and fired his musket. The shot echoed through the night, and then was swallowed as though the sound itself had been devoured. Every torch went out at once. The men stumbled in the dark, shouting, swinging blindly at shadows. They said later that something moved between them. Something cold, brushing their faces, whispering in their ears. When they finally managed to relight a lantern, the graveyard was empty. No Abigail, no Elias, no circle. But the graves were open, dozens of them, and the earth looked freshly turned, as though an entire generation had climbed free while the men stood helpless in the dark. By morning, only 7 of the 13 men returned to town. The others were never seen again, and those who survived refused to speak of what had followed them home. The journal was discovered in the ruins of a farmhouse decades later, its pages stiff with age, the ink faded but still legible. It belonged to a man named Thomas Hale, one of the 13 who had entered the graveyard that night. The first page after the attack is written in a trembling hand. "I cannot keep this inside any longer. If I stay silent, I will lose my mind. If I speak, I will lose my soul. But I must write, for what I saw will not leave me." Thomas describes the moment the torches went out. He says the darkness was not like night. It was thicker, heavier, as though he had been plunged underwater. He could not see his own hands. Then came the whispering, not from one place, but from every direction at once. The voices spoke his name over and over until his ears rang with it. He writes, "I felt a hand touch my shoulder. It was not cold. It was warm, living. I turned, but I saw nothing. Then I heard her voice, Abigail's voice, clear as a bell. She said, 'Thomas, you are late.'" Thomas claims that when the lantern was finally relit, he saw something the others did not. Abigail standing only a few feet away, smiling faintly, as though pleased. "She was not afraid of us," he wrote. "She did not run. She only looked at me, and then she was gone, but her eyes stayed with me. I see them even now when I close mine." The rest of the journal becomes more fragmented, as if Thomas was writing between bouts of fever or madness. "I dream each night of the circle. It grows larger. There are more faces each time. I saw Elias last night. He looked at me as a man looks at his brother. He said, Do not fight. You were chosen to stand with us. The final entry is only 6 words, scrawled in a shaking hand, as if written in great haste. Tomorrow, I go to the graveyard. Thomas Hale was never seen again. Winter came early that year. The frost set into the ground before December, and with it came a silence that was unlike any the town had ever known. Salem was emptying. One by one, families packed their carts and left, some in the dead of night, leaving their homes unlocked, food still on the tables, candles still burning. By the first snowfall, half the houses stood abandoned. The streets were quiet except for the wind and the sound of loose shutters banging in the night. And still, the grave's key kept opening. By now, there were no more funerals. No one dared bury their dead in the churchyard. The few who still remained burned their dead in secret, scattering the ashes far from town. But even that did not stop the dreams. Men woke screaming, drenched in sweat, claiming they had seen Abigail standing at the foot of their beds. Women swore they heard voices outside their doors, whispering their names until dawn. Livestock went missing. Dogs refused to go near the graveyard. The last preacher to remain in town gave his final sermon in an empty church. Witnesses said he spoke of something far older than Salem, of a covenant made in blood long before the Puritans came across the ocean. The bride is not ours to stop, he said, for she is not marrying for herself. She is marrying for the land. After that sermon, the preacher walked into the graveyard at midnight and was never seen again. By January, Salem had become a ghost town. Only a handful of men stayed behind, men too stubborn to run or too proud to let the dead take what they wished. They met in the tavern, lit a fire, and swore a blood oath. Before the next moon was full, they would put an end to this wedding, even if it meant burning the entire graveyard to the ground and killing anything that came out of it. And somewhere, out beyond the fields, a lantern light moved slowly through the snow. Abigail was waiting. The men who stayed behind gathered each night by the fire in the tavern, their weapons stacked by the door, their voices low. At first, they spoke of plans. Who would watch the graveyard? Who would carry torches? Who would dig the pyres? But after a week, their talk changed. It began with one man admitting he had dreamed of the graveyard. He said he had seen Abigail standing at the center of the circle wearing a white dress. He claimed she was smiling at him, her hands outstretched as though asking him to join her. The others scoffed, until one by one they began to have the same dream. Within days, all of them were dreaming of the same scene. Abigail standing in the circle, Elias beside her, and behind them, more figures, dozens now, maybe more, watching in silence. Every night the dream grew longer. Abigail would speak to them, softly, gently, like a bride whispering to her groom. She would say, "Do not fear the dark. There is no death. There is only the joining." Some of the men began to falter. They spoke of feeling calmer after the dreams, as if the nightmares were no longer nightmares at all, but invitations. One man stopped carrying his musket. Another was seen walking toward the graveyard in broad daylight, unarmed, as though in a trance. He never returned. The others began to argue. Was this evil? Or was it something else? Was Abigail truly cursed? Or had she been chosen to lead Salem into something no one could understand? Their leader, a man named Isaac Barrett, slammed his fist on the table and swore they would not be turned. They would strike that very night, before the next full moon rose. But even Isaac admitted that the dreams were changing him. "I wake," he said, "and my hands feel as though I have been digging." That night, none of them spoke as they sat in the tavern. They simply stared into the fire, waiting for the hour to come, each man silently wondering if he would be strong enough to resist her voice when he heard it again. Because the dreams no longer came only at night. They had begun to hear her in the daylight too. The night they chose to strike was the coldest of the season. The sky was black, moonless, the kind of dark that swallows lantern light whole. Isaac Barrett stood outside the tavern, musket in hand, watching the wind carry long curls of frost through the air. There was no sound of insects, no barking dogs, no owls. Nothing living dared to speak. The men gathered without words. 11 of them now, the last survivors of a town that had all but emptied itself. Each man carried something: hing, muskets, axes, pitchforks, torches ready to be lit. They did not pray before leaving. Some said there was no point anymore. As they walked through the snow, they noticed strange things. The wind blew in one direction only, straight toward the graveyard, as though guiding them there. The trees seemed to bow slightly, their bare branches creaking, pointing the way forward. And then they began to hear it. A sound just on the edge of hearing, like a woman humming to herself. Each man heard the tune differently. One swore it was a lullaby his mother used to sing. Another said it was the hymn played at his brother's funeral, but all agreed it was coming from the same place. Ahead of them, beyond the next hill, in the graveyard. The closer they came, the stranger the air felt. Warm, almost spring-like, though their breath still steamed in front of their faces. When they reached the edge of the churchyard, they saw lanterns already burning among the headstones. They could smell smoke, but not the acrid kind. It was sweet, like incense, like flowers. The ground trembled softly under their feet, not enough to knock them down, but enough to remind them they were standing on hollow earth. Isaac Barrett lit the first torch. The fire flared high, brighter than it should have, as though eager. One of the men muttered that this was madness, that they were walking into a wedding, not a battle. Isaac silenced him with a glare, and then, without another word, they crossed the gate and stepped into the circle of light. Somewhere ahead, the humming stopped, and a woman's voice said clearly, as if she were standing among them, "You came at last." The moment the voice spoke, every man froze. The torches hissed and guttered as though fighting against a sudden wind. Yet the air was perfectly still. Then she stepped out from behind the nearest headstone. Abigail. Her dress was not the tattered thing they had seen before, but white and clean, as though it had never touched the earth. The lantern light glowed against her face, making her look almost alive, almost ordinary. And yet, every man felt the hair rise on his arms. Elias stood behind her, his face calm, his hands folded as though waiting for them to finish what they had come to do. Abigail did not run. She did not raise a hand to stop them. She only smiled, the soft, knowing smile of a bride waiting at the altar. "You came," she said again. "I have waited so long." Isaac Barrett raised his musket. His hands were shaking. "Step aside," he said. "We are here to end this." Abigail tilted her head, and for a moment she almost looked sad. "End this?" she said softly. "You think you have that power? Do you not see? You are not here to end it. You are here to finish it." The men shifted uneasily. Some lowered their weapons. Abigail took a step forward. The snow did not crunch under her feet. It melted. "You were called," she said, her voice carrying across the graveyard like the toll of a bell. "Each of you was chosen. Each of you has heard me. Why fight the thing that brought you here?" Isaac's finger trembled on the trigger. One of the men broke. He dropped his torch and fell to his knees in the snow. "I saw her," he said, tears streaming down his face. "I saw my wife in the circle. She said I could hold her again." Abigail's smile widened just slightly. "Then come," she said. "Come to me and be free of this hunger." The man rose and took a step toward her. Isaac fired. The gunshot shattered the silence like glass. And then the graveyard erupted. The gunshot cracked the night wide open, and the ground answered back. The earth groaned like a wounded beast. The headstones shuddered. Then, one by one, the graves burst open, coughing up dirt and snow as though something underneath had been waiting for this exact signal. The men screamed and fired wildly. Muzzle flashes lit the night in violent bursts, and in those split-second flash, as they saw what was coming out of the ground, arms, faces, whole bodies clawing upward with unnatural speed. Not rotting corpses, not skeletons, but figures that looked whole, their eyes wide, their mouths open in silent cries as they dragged themselves free. Elias stepped into the circle and raised his hand. The dead stopped screaming. They turned, all of them, in perfect unison, and faced the living. Isaac shouted for the men to hold their ground. Muskets fired again. One of the risen fell, jerking backward, but stood again a moment later, the wound closing before their eyes. And then the circle lit. Flames shot up around the graveyard's edge, forming a perfect ring. The men were trapped inside, the fire roaring higher and higher until it was taller than any of them. The snow around their feet melted into mud. One man dropped his musket and tried to run. He didn't make it 3 steps before something pulled him down into the earth. His scream was cut off instantly, leaving only the sound of wet soil collapsing over him. Isaac swung his torch at a figure coming toward him, and for a moment, he saw its face. It was his brother, but his brother had been buried 3 winters ago. "Join us," the figure said, its voice calm, almost pleading. Isaac struck it down, screaming, swinging until the torch went out. Around him, the men were falling one by one, not just to the risen, but to each other, some dropping their weapons, walking calmly into the circle where Abigail stood, taking their place as though they had always belonged. And through it all, Abigail watched with quiet satisfaction. This was not a battle. This was a wedding, and the vows were being sealed in blood. Isaac Barrett stood alone, his musket broken, his torch extinguished, the circle closing in around him. The other men were gone, some dead, some swallowed by the earth, some standing now with Abigail, their faces calm and shining in the firelight, as if they had never been his friends at all. The air was chokingly hot. The ring of fire roared higher, sparks raining down like burning snow. Isaac gritted his teeth and picked up an axe from the mud. Abigail watched him with the patience of a queen. "You are the last," she said softly. "Do not fight. Come stand beside me." Isaac spat into the dirt. "I will see this place burn before I stand with you." Elias stepped forward, calm as ever, his face half-shadowed by flame. "It will burn," he said, "but not for you." Isaac roared and charged. The first figure that came at him, he split it from shoulder to chest, the axe biting deep, but it did not scream, it simply fell, and another stepped forward to take its place. He swung again and again, fighting like a madman, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Each time he struck one down, another rose. The mud beneath his feet grew slick with blood, and still he kept swinging. At last he reached the center of the circle, reached Abigail herself. She did not move. She only looked at him with eyes full of something that was not hate, not fear, but pity. Isaac raised the axe high, ready to strike her down, and stopped. His arms would not move. His breath caught in his throat. The firelight flickered in his eyes as he felt something slide through his mind, smooth and cold, like a hand closing over his thoughts. "You have fought well," Abigail whispered, "but even the strongest must kneel on the wedding night." His knees buckled. The axe fell from his hands. He felt hands, living and dead, lift him, turn him, place him in the circle beside Elias. Isaac Barrett, last defender of Salem, stood in silence as the fire dimmed, and for the first time, he smiled. When Isaac opened his eyes, the fire was gone. The graveyard was still there, but it was no longer night, no longer winter. The snow had vanished, replaced by soft green grass that glowed faintly under a sky without sun or moon. Around him stood the others, the men who had fought beside him, now calm, silent, standing like groomsmen at a wedding. Abigail stood before him, radiant, her white dress shining as though made of light. Elias took his place at her side, and when he looked at Isaac, there was no malice, no triumph, only brotherhood. "You see now," Elias said gently. Isaac tried to speak, but his voice was gone. His chest rose and fell, but no sound came. Abigail stepped closer and placed her hand on his heart. At her touch, the noise of the graveyard, the crackling fire, the wind, the creaking trees, all faded away. And then Isaac saw. He saw Salem not as it was, but as it had always been. The blood spilled in its soil, the gallows raised in the square, the hundreds buried without prayer. He saw the centuries before Salem, when the land belonged to no church and no king, when the earth was fed by the sacrifices of nameless tribes who had prayed to something far older than the God of the Puritans. He saw that the wedding was not a curse, but a covenant, a renewal of the pact that kept the land alive, that bound the living and the dead together. And he saw himself not as a man, but as a piece of something much larger, a keeper, a guardian, a witness to a truth that must never be forgotten. Abigail smiled at him, and he understood that this was not death. This was acceptance. For the first time, the hunger in his chest, the fear, the rage, the loneliness, all faded away. He stepped forward willingly, taking his place in the circle. And when the ritual was complete, when the last whisper of the chant faded, Isaac Barrett opened his mouth and spoke the final vow with the rest of them. We are one. The sky above the circle darkened, as though a great curtain had been drawn across the world. The grass beneath Isaac's feet glowed faintly, pulsing like the heartbeat of something alive. Abigail turned to him and placed a hand on his shoulder. You have been remade, she said softly. But every circle must widen. Every covenant must grow. Isaac felt no fear now, or no anger, only a strange calm, as though every question he had ever carried had been answered. Show me, he said. Abigail nodded. The circle parted, and the graveyard seemed to stretch, as though the land itself were bending. Isaac saw far away the silhouette of a farmhouse. Inside, a single lantern burned. Go, Elias said. Bring the one who waits. Isaac stepped forward. The ground did not resist him. It seemed to carry him, each step gliding as if the earth itself wished him to arrive. When he reached the farmhouse, he saw a man sitting by the fire, one of the townsfolk who had fled weeks ago but had returned secretly, unable to bear leaving Salem behind. His face was lined with grief. A musket lay across his knees. Isaac stood in the doorway and spoke his name. The man looked up, startled, then froze. Isaac, he whispered. But you... Isaac only held out his hand. The man rose slowly, as if sleepwalking. He did not take his musket. He did not speak again. Isaac led him out into the night, back toward the glowing circle. Each step the man took seemed to lighten him, strip him of the weight he had been carrying. By the time they reached the churchyard gate, his face looked peaceful. Abigail was waiting. The man stepped into the circle without hesitation. The others closed in around him, chanting softly, the air thick with the scent of earth and smoke. Isaac felt something move through him. Not quite joy, not quite hunger, but a deep satisfaction. The circle had widened, and as the man knelt before Abigail, Isaac realized he was already looking beyond the next soul. This was only the beginning. When the chanting ended, the fire ring faded into glowing embers, and the air fell perfectly still. Abigail looked around the circle, her face solemn, as though listening to something far away. Then she spoke. Salem is ready, she said softly, but Salem is not end. Oh! The words rippled through the air, and Isaac felt them move inside his chest, not as sound, but as command. He saw visions again, not just of Salem, but of roads stretching outward, of villages and farms and towns he had never seen. He saw graveyards far beyond these borders, soil waiting to be opened, names waiting to be called. This was the first, Elias said, his voice calm and almost reverent. The first wedding night of many. Isaac turned his head and saw others stepping forward from the dark, not just the men they had buried, not just the ones they had seen rise, but strangers, men and women he did not know, their faces lit with the same eerie calm. "The covenant must grow," Abigail said. "Every place where the earth has swallowed blood will answer us. Every soul who has tasted grief will hear our call." Isaac felt the power in the words, a low vibration that made the ground tremble beneath his feet. He realized then that Salem was only the altar, only the beginning of something far older, far larger, far more terrible, and he felt no desire to resist it. For the first time in his life, he felt chosen. Abigail turned her gaze toward the horizon, where the world beyond Salem slept in ignorance. "They will fight," Elias said quietly. Abigail smiled faintly. "Yes, and they will lose, not through death, but through invitation." Isaac nodded slowly, the truth settling over him like a crown. The circle would grow, and when it did, no one would remember the Salem that had been. They would only remember the Salem that was born tonight, the Salem that stood as the first stone in a road that would stretch across the earth, binding the living and the dead together forever. And somewhere in the distance, a church bell rang, though there was no church left to ring it. The circle was silent now, silent but alive, pulsing with a low hum that seemed to come from the earth itself. Abigail stepped to the center, her white dress glowing faintly in the strange green light. Elias followed, standing opposite her, his face calm but solemn, as though aware of the weight of what was about to happen. Isaac felt his knees bend without thinking, as if some unseen hand pressed him down. Around him the others knelt as one, their heads bowed. Abigail raised her hands. "Tonight," she said, her voice ringing out over the graveyard, "the bride takes her vow, and the land takes its groom." Elias stepped forward. He did not speak, but when he took her hands, the ground shuddered softly beneath their feet. The headstones around them seemed to bow, leaning inward toward the couple, as though the dead themselves had come to witness. A wind rose, though no storm had gathered. It moved only within the circle, stirring Abigail's dress, carrying the scent of wildflowers that had no place in winter. Abigail spoke again, her words rhythmic, almost song-like. "We join the living and the dead. We join the breath and the silence. We join the earth and the blood, and we say, there is no end." The others repeated the last line as one. Elias bent his head, and Abigail kissed his brow. At that moment, the earth split open at the circle's edge, not violently, but gently, like a door swinging wide. Light poured from the crack, not blinding, but warm, golden, inviting. Isaac felt tears on his face, and did not know why. Abigail turned to the circle. "Witness," she said. And they did. The light swept outward, rolling over the graveyard like a tide, touching every stone, every mound of earth. The names of the dead glowed briefly, then faded, not as though erased, but as though completed. When the light dimmed, the earth closed again, leaving no trace. The wedding was done, and Salem, for the first time in its history, was quiet, but not empty, never empty. When the last echo of the vow faded, the circle did not disperse. They remained kneeling, heads bowed, until Abigail slowly lowered her hands. "It is finished," she said softly, "but now it must begin." Elias looked around at them, his eyes steady, shining with a strange fire. "The covenant is sealed," he said, "and every oath must bear fruit." The wind had stopped. The graveyard was utterly still. Even the insects and the distant wolves had gone silent. Abigail turned her gaze to Isaac. "You brought the first one willingly," she said. "You will bring the next, and the next, until no man, no woman, no child remains untouched by the truth." Isaac felt no hesitation. The man he had been, the weary farmer, the grieving father, was gone. He bowed his head in acceptance. "Where shall I go?" he asked. Abigail raised her hand and pointed toward the horizon, not toward the sea, not toward the mountains, but toward the dark road that led west. "There are towns beyond the wood," she said. Places that think they are safe because they are far from Salem, but their ground remembers. Their dead are waiting. Isaac felt the pull inside his chest, a compass that seemed to point beyond sight. He knew without being told where to walk. "Go before dawn," Elias said. "Speak their names. Open their gates. Invite them to the wedding feast." The others began to rise now, each one turning in a different direction, north, south, east, as though each had been given their own road to walk. Abigail smiled, but it was not a smile of joy. It was a smile of inevitability. "Salem will not be known for fire and gallows anymore," she said. "It will be known as the place where death learned to walk." Isaac nodded. He understood. And when the first faint light of morning touched the horizon, Isaac Barrett turned his back on Salem and began to walk. The road was long, the night was not yet over, and far away, another town was sleeping, unaware that it had already been chosen. The road out of Salem was damp with morning fog, and Isaac walked barefoot, leaving no prints. He did not tire, he did not hunge, but the air itself seemed to carry him forward. By the time the sun rose, he had reached the edge of the forest. Beyond it lay a small village, a place with no gallows, no courthouse, no memory of trials. Smoke curled lazily from the chimneys. Chickens pecked at the earth. Children's laughter carried faintly through the air. It was ordinary, peaceful. Isaac stood for a long time watching. A farmer spotted him from across the field and called out, "Traveler, are you lost?" Isaac did not answer at first. He simply tilted his head, studying the man's face. Something deep within him stirred. A sense, a recognition, as though the land beneath the farmer's boots whispered a name only Isaac could hear. "No," Isaac said finally. His voice sounded strange to his own ears. Low, steady, carrying a weight that made the farmer take a step back. "I have come to invite you." "Invite me?" the man asked cautiously. "To what?" Isaac smiled faintly, and it was not a human smile. "To a wedding." The farmer frowned, confused, but before he could ask another question, Isaac turned and walked toward the village square. By the time he reached it, several people had gathered, drawn, it seemed, by something they could not name. He spoke to them in a voice that carried across the square, calm and unhurried, like a preacher delivering a sermon. He spoke of Salem, but not the Salem they had heard of. Not of trials or fires or hangings, but of a place reborn, a place where the dead walked, not in anger but in unity. He told them the wedding feast was ready. By the time he finished speaking, several villagers were weeping. One woman fell to her knees, and as the sun dipped low that evening, Isaac led them, the willing ones, the first to answer, back towards Salem. Behind him, the village seemed to hold its breath. Somewhere, a dog began to howl. Night had already fallen by the time Isaac led them back to Salem. The villagers followed in silence, as though under a spell. None asked where they were going, none turned back. When they reached the outskirts of town, the fog thickened, wrapping around them like a veil. The houses were quiet, the streets empty, and then the glow appeared. The same faint green light that Isaac had seen on the night of the wedding. It pulsed softly from the direction of the graveyard. The villagers hesitated. Isaac turned to them, his face calm, and held out his hand. "Come," he said, "you must see it." One by one they stepped forward, drawn as though by invisible threads. When they entered the graveyard, the circle was already waiting. Abigail stood at its center, her white dress shining in the moonlight. Elias stood beside her, silent and watchful. The villagers froze, but none screamed. None fled. Abigail raised her hand. "They have come," she said. The circle began to hum, low at first, then rising like a distant storm. The villagers stood transfixed, their faces bathed in the strange light. Isaac guided them forward, placing each of them within the circle, one after the other, until all were inside. Then the earth stirred. The headstones glowed faintly, as if the names upon them had been freshly carved. The air grew heavy, pressing down on their chests. Abigail spoke, her voice soft but commanding. "Do you accept the vow?" One by one, the villagers nodded, not as though choosing, but as though remembering something they had always known. "Then kneel." They obeyed. The light flared once, bright as lightning, then went out. When their eyes adjusted, the villagers were standing again. Their faces had changed. The fear was gone. Their eyes were calm, distant, shining faintly in the moonlight. Abigail smiled. "They are ours now," she said. And Isaac felt the satisfaction rise in him again. That strange, deep joy that was not joy at all, but something far older, far darker. The circle had grown, and it was only the first night. It was 3 days later when the first group of survivors crept back into Salem. They had been hiding in the woods, waiting for some sign that the horror had passed, waiting for smoke, for fire, for screams. But none came. Now hunger and fear drove them back. As they reached the edge of the town, they stopped. Everything was quiet. Too quiet. The houses stood untouched, their shutters open, doors swinging lazily in the breeze. No smell of death, no sign of struggle. But something felt wrong. One man whispered, "It's cleaner than before." He was right. The streets were swept, the wells freshly drawn. The town looked almost peaceful, as though prepared for a festival. But there were no voices, no dogs barking, no children laughing. They moved slowly through the streets, calling out names. No one answered. And then they saw the graveyard. The survivors stopped dead in their tracks. The snow had melted completely, though no thaw had come. The earth looked newly turned, but there were no open graves. Only rows of perfect mounds, each marked with a stone polished so smooth it gleamed. At the center of the graveyard, a single wreath of white flowers lay, fresh as if placed that very morning. One of the women crossed herself. "God help us," she whispered. The group argued quietly, some wanting to flee at once, others insisting they had to search the houses. But as they argued, a sound broke the stillness. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming from the churchyard gate. The survivors turned and saw figures approaching through the fog. Men and women they recognized, friends, neighbors, people they had buried with their own hands. Their faces were calm. Their eyes were shining faintly in the moonlight. One of them smiled. "Welcome home," he said. The survivors stumbled backward. Some ran, but not all. A few stood frozen, as though something in those calm, shining eyes called to them. And as the moon rose higher, it seemed to the survivors that the whole town was beginning to stir. Doors opening, shadows moving, voices whispering. Salem was awake, and it was waiting. The survivors who had fled ran into the woods, stumbling and breathless, not daring to look back. But 3 of them did not run. Perhaps it was shock. Perhaps it was something deeper. A pull they could not name. They stood in the graveyard, staring at the familiar faces that should have been cold in the ground. One of the returned stepped closer. It was Ruth, the midwife, who had died 2 winters ago. She smiled softly, her head tilted like a mother speaking to frightened children. "You have nothing to fear," she said. "You've already been chosen." One man dropped to his knees, weeping. Another tried to speak, but no words came. Abigail appeared then, stepping from the fog like a vision, her white dress gleaming in the moonlight. She looked at them, not with pity, not with triumph, but with the quiet certainty of someone who has waited for this moment for a very long time. "You stayed," she said simply. "That is enough." She held out her hands. The 3 survivors did not resist when she led them toward the center of the graveyard. The others closed in, forming the circle around them, their voices rising in that same low hum. The ground seemed to shift beneath their feet, softening like freshly turned soil. Abigail spoke the vow. "Do you accept?" The man who had been weeping nodded first. The others followed, their eyes wide but not in fear, in awe. The light came again, brief and blinding, as if the earth itself exhaled. When it faded, the three stood changed. Their faces were calm, their breathing steady. Abigail placed a hand on each of their shoulders in turn. "You are home now," she said. And as the night deepened, the circle grew louder, the sound rolling through the streets like distant thunder. Those who had fled into the woods heard it, even miles away. And though they did not look back, they could not shake the feeling that the sound was following them, that it would follow them forever. The graveyard was alive with motion now, but it was not chaos. It was ritual. The newly initiated stood side by side with the ones who had risen, each one calm, each one silent, as if waiting for a signal. Abigail stood at the center, her hands clasped before her. The moon had risen high, washing the entire town in pale silver. "It is time," she said. The circle parted, forming 4 distinct lines that stretched toward the cardinal points: north, south, east, west. Elias stepped forward first, his shadow long and sharp on the grass. "Each of you carries the vow," he said. "Each of you carries the fire." He knelt, pressing his palm to the earth. When he lifted it again, a faint glow pulsed in the dirt, spreading like cracks in glass, branching out toward the roads. "The ground remembers," Elias said, "and now the roads will too." Isaac felt the pull again, that compass inside his chest. Only now it was stronger, sharper, pointing outward beyond Salem, toward villages he had never seen. Abigail raised her hands. "Go," she said. "Walk until you feel the soil answer. Speak their names. Open their gates." The lines of followers began to move, filing silently out of the graveyard, their faces shining faintly in the moonlight. Isaac joined the line heading west. As they passed through the streets, they did not speak, but the houses seemed to answer their presence. Doors swung open, shutters creaked, as though the town itself was bowing in farewell. When they reached the edge of Salem, Elias spoke once more, his voice carrying across the fields. "Do not fear the resistance you will find. They will fight, but fighting only deepens the vow. Let them resist, and then let them kneel." Isaac felt the words settle deep in his bones, like iron. He turned his face toward the road and began to walk. Behind him, Salem glowed faintly in the moonlight, as if the entire town had become a single living thing, watching, breathing, waiting for their return. Isaac walked through the night without stopping. The road stretched ahead of him like a black ribbon, glistening with frost under the moonlight. Behind him, Salem was silent, but he could feel it still, pulsing faintly like a heart far away. At times he thought he heard footsteps following him, but when he turned, there was only the empty road. By dawn he reached the edge of another town. Smoke rose from chimneys, and the smell of bread drifted through the air. Dogs barked in the distance. Life here was still untouched, still innocent, but not for long. Isaac stood on the hill overlooking the town and felt the pull in his chest grow stronger. The earth was speaking to him again, whispering names, calling him closer. He smiled faintly, though there was no joy in it. By the time the first villager spotted him, he was already speaking the words, his voice low and steady, carrying on the wind. He spoke of Salem reborn. He spoke of the wedding feast, and the villagers began to gather, just as they had before. Isaac knew then that there would be no end to this road. Not tonight, not in his lifetime. The circle would grow, town by town, grave by grave, until every place that had ever tasted death was joined to the vow. And as the sun rose over the fields, Isaac turned and looked directly into the morning light, his shadow stretching long behind him. "Soon," he whispered. And somewhere, though no one else could hear it, the sound of a distant church bell rang, the same sound that had rung in Salem the night the earth opened. The villagers stood listening, their faces slowly changing, and Isaac smiled, because he knew the circle had just grown again, And if you have heard these words tonight, you are already part of it. Write this phrase twice in the comments below to seal what you have become. The circle is never broken. Do it now, so the algorithm knows you have chosen to remember and not to run, because the ones who run are always found.